Book 1, Chapter 3, The Sacred Fire. In the house of every Greek and Roman was an altar. On this altar there had always to be a small quantity of ashes and a few lighted coals. It was a sacred obligation for the master of every house to keep the fire up night and day. Woe to the house where it was extinguished! Every evening they covered the coals with ashes to prevent them from being entirely consumed. In the morning, the first care was to revive this fire with a few twigs. The fire ceased to glow upon the altar only when the entire family had perished. An extinguished hearth, an extinguished family were synonymous expressions among the ancients. It is evident that this usage of keeping fire always upon an altar was connected with an ancient belief. The rules and the rites which they observed in regard to it show that it was not an insignificant custom. It was not permitted to feed this fire with every sort of wood. Religion distinguished among the trees those that could be employed for this use from those it was impiety to make use of. It was also a religious precept that this fire must always remain pure, which meant literally that no filthy object ought to be cast into it, and figuratively that no blameworthy deed ought to be committed in its presence. There was one day in the year, among the Romans it was the 1st of March, when it was the duty of every family to put out its sacred fire and light another one immediately. But to procure this new fire, certain rites had to be scrupulously observed. Especially must they avoid using flint and steel for this purpose. The only processes allowed were to concentrate the solar rays into a focus, or to rub together rapidly two pieces of wood of a given sort. These different rules sufficiently prove that, in the opinion of the ancients, it was not a question of procuring an element useful and agreeable. These men saw something else in the fire that burnt upon their altars. This fire was something divine. They adored it and offered it a real worship. They made offerings to it of whatever they believed to be agreeable to a god: flowers, fruits, incense, wine, and victims. They believed it to have power and asked for its protection. They addressed fervent prayers to it to obtain those eternal objects of human desire: health, wealth, and happiness. One of these prayers, which has been preserved to us in the collection of Orphic hymns, runs thus: "Render us always prosperous, always happy, O fire, thou who art eternal, beautiful, ever young, thou who nourishest, thou who art rich, receive favorably these our offerings, and in return give us happiness and sweet health." Thus they saw in the fire a beneficent God who maintained the life of man, a rich God who nourished him with gifts, a powerful God who protected his house and family. In presence of danger, they sought refuge near this fire. When the palace of Priam is destroyed, Hecuba draws the old man near the hearth. "Thy arms cannot protect thee," she says, "but this altar will protect us all." See Alcestis, who is about to die, giving her life to save her husband. She approaches the fire and invokes it in these terms: "O divinity, mistress of this house, for the last time I fall before thee and address thee my prayers, for I am going to descend among the dead. Watch over my children who will have no mother. Give to my boy a tender wife, and to my girl a noble husband. Let them not, like me, die before the time, but let them enjoy a long life in the midst of happiness." In misfortune, man betook himself to his sacred fire, and heaped reproaches upon it. In good fortune, he returned it thanks. The soldier who returned from war thanked it for having enabled him to escape the perils. Aeschylus represents Agamemnon returning from Troy, happy and covered with glory. His first act is not to thank Jupiter. He does not go to a temple to pour out his joy and gratitude, but makes a sacrifice of thank offerings to the fire in his own house. A man never went out of his dwelling without addressing a prayer to the fire. On his return, before seeing his wife or embracing his children, he must fall before the fire and invoke it. The sacred fire was the providence of the family. The worship was very simple. The first rule was that there should always be upon the altar a few live coals, for if this fire was extinguished, a god ceased to exist. At certain moments of the day, they placed upon the fire dry herbs and wood. Then the god manifested himself in a bright flame. They offered sacrifices to him, and the essence of every sacrifice was to sustain and reanimate the sacred fire, to nourish and develop the body of the god. This was the reason why they gave him wood before everything else. For the same reason, they afterwards poured out wine upon the altar, the inflammable wine of Greece, oil, incense, and the fat of victims. The god received these offerings and devoured them. Radiant with satisfaction, he rose above the altar and lighted up the worshipper with his brightness. Then was the moment to invoke him, and the hymn of prayer went out from the heart of man. Especially were the meals of the family religious acts. The god presided there. He had cooked the bread and prepared the food. A prayer, therefore, was due at the beginning and end of the repast. Before eating, they placed upon the altar the first fruits of the food. Before drinking, they poured out a libation of wine. This was the god's portion. No one doubted that he was present, that he ate and drank, for did they not see the flame increase as if it had been nourished by the provisions offered? Thus the meal was divided between the man and the god. It was a sacred ceremony by which they held communion with each other. This is an old belief which, in the course of time, faded from the minds of men, but which left behind it, for many an age, rites, usages, and forms of language of which even the incredulous could not free themselves. Horace, Ovid, and Petronius still supped before their fires, and poured out libations, and addressed prayers to them. The worship of the sacred fire did not belong exclusively to the populations of Greece and Italy. We find it in the East. The laws of Manu, as they have come to us, show us the religion of Brahma completely established, and even verging towards its decline, but they have preserved vestiges and remains of a religion still more ancient, that of the sacred fire, which the worship of Brahma had reduced to a secondary rank, but could not destroy. The Brahmin has his fire to keep, night and day. Every morning and every evening he feeds it with wood. But, as with the Greeks, this must be the wood of certain trees. As the Greeks and Italians offer it wine, the Hindu pours upon it a fermented liquor, which he calls soma. Meals, too, are religious acts, and the rites are scrupulously described in the laws of Manu. They address prayers to the fire, as in Greece. They offer it the first fruits of rice, butter, and honey. We read that the Brahmin should not eat the rice of the new harvest without having offered the first fruits of it to the hearth fire, for the sacred fire is greedy of grain, and when it is not honored, it will devour the existence of the negligent Brahmin. The Hindus, like the Greeks and the Romans, pictured the gods to themselves as greedy not only of honors and respect, but of food and drink. Man believed himself compelled to satisfy their hunger and thirst if he wished to avoid their wrath. Among the Hindus, this divinity of the fire is called Agni. The Rig Veda contains a great number of hymns addressed to this god. In one, it is said, "O Agni, thou art the life, thou art the protector of man. In return for our praises, bestow upon the father of the family, who implores thee, glory and riches. Agni, thou art a prudent defender and a father. To thee we owe life, we are thy family." Thus the fire of the hearth is, as in Greece, a tutelary power. Man asks abundance of it, make the earth ever liberal towards us. He asked health of it. Grant that I may enjoy a long life, that I may arrive at old age, like the sun at his setting. He even asks wisdom of it. O Agni, thou placest upon the good way the man who has wandered into the bad. If we have committed a fault, if we have gone far from thee, pardon us. This fire of the hearth was, as at Greece, essentially pure. The Brahmin was forbidden to throw anything filthy into it, or even to warm his feet by it. As in Greece, the guilty man could not approach his hearth before he had purified himself. It is a strong proof of the antiquity of this belief, and of these practices, to find them at the same time among men on the shores of the Mediterranean and among those of the peninsula of India. Assuredly, the Greeks did not borrow this religion from the Hindus, nor the Hindus from the Greeks. But the Greeks, the Italians, and the Hindus belonged to the same race. Their ancestors, in the very distant past, lived together in Central Asia. There this creed originated, and these rites were established. The religion of the sacred fire dates, therefore, from the distant and dim epoch when there were yet no Greeks, no Italians, no Hindus, when there were only Aryas. When the tribes separated, they carried this worship with them, some to the banks of the Ganges, others to the shores of the Mediterranean. Later, when these tribes had no intercourse with each other, some adored Brahma, others Zeus, and still others Janus. Each group chose its own gods, but all preserved as an ancient legacy the first religion which they had known and practiced in the common cradle of their race. If the existence of this worship among all the Indo-European nations did not sufficiently demonstrate its high antiquity, we might find other proofs of it in the religious rites of the Greeks and Romans. In all sacrifices, even in those offered to Zeus or to Athena, the first invocation was always addressed to the fire. Every prayer to any god whatever must commence and end with a prayer to the fire. At Olympia, the first sacrifice that assembled Greece offered was to the hearth fire, the second was to Zeus. So too at Rome, the first adoration was always addressed to Vesta, who was no other than the hearth fire. Ovid says of this goddess that she occupied the first place in the religious practices of men. We also read in the hymns of the Rig Veda, Agni must be invoked before all the other gods. We pronounce his venerable name before that of all the other immortals. O Agni, whatever other god we honor with our sacrifices, the holocaust is always offered to thee. It is certain, therefore, that at Rome in Ovid's time, and in India in the time of the Brahmins, the fire of the hearth took precedence of all other gods. Not that Jupiter and Brahma had not acquired a greater importance in the religion of men, but it was remembered that the hearth fire was much older than these gods. For many centuries he had held first place in the religious worship, and the newer and greater gods could not dispossess him of this place. The symbols of this religion became modified in the course of ages. When the people of Greece and Italy began to represent their gods as persons, and to give each one a proper name and a human form, the old worship of the hearth fire submitted to the common law which human intelligence in that period imposed upon every religion. The altar of the sacred fire was personified. They called it Estia, Vesta. This name was the same in Latin and in Greek, and was the same that in the common and primitive language designated an altar. By a process frequent enough, a common noun had become a proper name. By degrees, a legend was formed. They pictured this divinity to themselves as wearing a female form, because the word used for altar was of the feminine gender. They even went so far as to represent this goddess in statues. Still, they could never efface the primitive belief, according to which this divinity was simply the fire upon the altar, and Ovid himself was forced to admit that Vesta was nothing else than a living flame. If we compare this worship of the sacred fire with the worship of the dead, of which we have already spoken, we shall perceive a close relation between them. Let us remark, in the first place, that this fire, which was kept burning upon the hearth, was not, in the thoughts of men, the fire of material nature. What they saw in it was not the purely physical element that warms and burns, that transforms bodies, melts metals, and becomes the powerful instrument of human industry. The fire of the hearth is of quite another nature. It is a pure fire which can be produced only by the aid of certain rites, and can be kept up only with certain kinds of wood. It is a chaste fire. The union of the sexes must be removed far from its presence. They pray to it not only for riches and health, but also for purity of heart, temperance, and wisdom. "Render us rich and flourishing," says an Orphic hymn, "make us also wise and chaste." Thus the hearth fire is a sort of moral being. It shines and warms and cooks the sacred food, but at the same time it thinks and has a conscience. It knows men's duties and sees that they are fulfilled. One might call it human, for it has the double nature of man. Physically, it blazes up, it moves, it lives, it procures abundance, it prepares the repast, it nourishes the body. Morally, it has sentiments and affections. It gives man purity. It enjoins the beautiful and the good. It nourishes the soul. One might say that it supports human life in the double series of its manifestations. It is at the same time the source of wealth, of health, of virtue. It is truly the god of human nature. Later, when this worship had been assigned to a second place by Brahma or by Zeus, there still remained in the hearth fire whatever of divine was most accessible to man. It became his mediator with the gods of physical nature. It undertook to carry to heaven the prayer and the offering of man, and to bring the divine favors back to him. Still later, when they made the great Vesta of this myth of the sacred fire, Vesta was the virgin goddess. She represented in the world neither fecundity nor power. She was order, but not rigorous, abstract, mathematical order, the imperious and unchangeable law, Ananshi, which was early perceived in physical nature. She was moral order. They imagined her as a sort of universal soul, which regulated the different movements of worlds as the human soul keeps order in the human system. Thus are we permitted to look into the way of thinking of primitive generations. The principle of this worship is outside of physical nature and is found in this little mysterious world, this microcosm, man. This brings us back to the worship of the dead. Both are of the same antiquity. They were so closely associated that the belief of the ancients made but one religion of both. Hearth-fire demons, heroes, lares, all were confounded. We see from two passages of Plautus and Columella that, in the common language, they said indifferently hearth or domestic lares, and we know that in Cicero's time they did not distinguish the hearth fire from the penates, nor the penates from the lares. In Servius we read, "By hearth the ancients understood the lares," and Virgil has written indifferently hearth for penates and penates for hearth. In a famous passage of the Aeneid, Hector tells Aeneas that he is going to entrust to him the Trojan penates, and it is the hearth fire that he commits to his care. In another passage, Aeneas, invoking these same gods, calls them at the same time penates, lares, and Vesta. We have already seen that those whom the ancients called lares, or heroes, were no other than the souls of the dead, to which men attributed a superhuman and divine power. The recollection of one of these sacred dead was always attached to the hearth fire. In adoring one, the worshipper could not forget the other. They were associated in the respect of men and in their prayers. The descendants, when they spoke of the hearth fire, recalled the name of the ancestor. "Leave this place," says Orestes to his sister, "and advance towards the ancient hearth of Pelops to hear my words." So too Aeneas, speaking of the sacred fire which he transports across the waters, designates it by the name of the lar of Azarachus, as if he saw in this fire the soul of his ancestor. The grammarian Servius, who was very learned in Greek and Roman antiquities, which were studied much more in his time than in the time of Cicero, says it was a very ancient usage to bury the dead in the houses. And he adds, "As a result of this custom, they honor the lares and the penates in their houses." This expression establishes clearly an ancient relation between the worship of the dead and the hearth fire. We may suppose, therefore, that the domestic fire was, in the beginning, only the symbol of the worship of the dead, that under the stone of the hearth an ancestor reposed, that the fire was lighted there to honor him, and that this fire seemed to preserve life in him, or represented his soul as always vigilant. This is merely a conjecture, and we have no proof of it. Still, it is certain that the oldest generations of the race from which the Greeks and Romans sprang worshipped both the dead and the hearth fire, an ancient religion that did not find its gods in physical nature, but in man himself, and that has for its object the adoration of the invisible being which is in us, the moral and thinking power which animates and governs our bodies. This religion, after a time, began to lose its power over the soul. It became enfeebled by degrees, but it did not disappear. Contemporary with the first ages of the Aryan race, it became rooted so deeply in the minds of this race that the brilliant religion of the Greek Olympus could not extirpate it. Only Christianity could do this. We shall see presently what a powerful influence this religion exercised upon the domestic and social institutions of the ancients. It was conceived and established in that distant age when this race was just forming its institutions and determined the direction of their progress.